Mr. King.
Thank you, Chair Pierce. Again, I'm appearing here on behalf of the HR Policy Association and SHRM. With respect to briefing, it's been my experience that briefs are helpful to the region, the regional director, in making the ultimate decision, also helpful to the board, and further helpful to have a more complete record. Beyond that, supervisory issues, as Member Johnson just mentioned, can be very fact-intensive. I mentioned the fact that twice the Supreme Court of this country has had to deal with Section 211 issues. They're not necessarily easy to address on a closing argument or indeed even with appropriate briefing. Further, I would cite multi-site voting unit cases where, as the board is well aware, the party articulating the position that the only appropriate unit is a multi-site unit must overcome the single-site presumption. That is not easily accomplished in a closing argument and is much better addressed, I would submit, by a brief. Finally, with respect to briefing, the board's decision in specialty health care, if it stands, imposes a considerable burden on a party that is contesting the sought-after unit and wishes to add or perhaps subtract. That's an open issue, apparently. Employees with respect to the unit. That is the old accretion test. Many of us argue improperly transferred to the representation proceeding context, but it's an exceedingly high standard, very fact-intensive. So briefing has, frankly, a positive impact, I think, of the whole determination process. With respect to the hearing officer recommendation issue, we touched upon this, but I don't know that we really drilled into it. The statute's quite clear. The hearing officer cannot make recommendations. But if the hearing officer is deciding whether 20% put inside the math issues that Jonathan Fritz articulated, the hearing officer in making those kinds of determinations, I would submit to you, is making a recommendation. You clearly have a statutory problem. Under the proposed rules, you have pushed the hearing officer into a recommendation process, whether you acknowledge it or not. And I think if this matter goes to a judicial proceeding, the board's going to have a great deal of difficulty defending its position on the recommendation issue. I want to close by talking about the board's challenge ballot procedure process, a process that's troubled me for some time. And in our statements at pages 10, 11, and 12, we get into this a bit. We went back and asked the board under a FOIA request how often the challenge ballot procedure has been utilized. And frankly, not that frequently. And in most cases, a very small number of potential voters. And I think that's good, because if you think about the challenge ballot procedure, it's flawed in many respects. And we cite in our paper studies in the voting rights movement, studies and analyses, where procedures similar to what happens in a challenge board ballot proceeding is looked on with a great deal of disgust and angst in the general election process. Stop and think about it. You have an individual that may not be interested in voting in the first instance. You try to explain perhaps to that individual that his or her vote's going to be challenged. Well, they may proceed to vote, maybe they won't. They go into a room that's foreign to them. The minute they proceed to the table to vote, either the board agent and or the employer representative or the union representative challenges this person. And at that point, they're wondering, why am I here? What's going on? Think about the civil rights movement and some of the challenges to voters in this country. Very repugnant. At any rate, let's assume that our voter continues to proceed to cast a vote, goes to the curtain, pulls the curtain, casts the ballot, comes back. His or her ballot then is placed in a special envelope with his or her name on it. And the individual at this point is wondering, what is going on here? Even though you've tried to explain the process in the first instance. Is someone going to know how I voted? Why are they taking my name? Why is this going in a special envelope? This whole process is fraught with potential abuse. And we could cite common cause studies in the general voting process itself. I think the board was well advised last time when it went through this process to drop the so-called 20% rule. I would strongly urge you to do it this time. If you continue to use this as a linchpin, i.e. to defer voting unit issues post-election, I would strongly then urge you to look at the whole challenge ballot voting procedure. I cite in our presentation some recent board elections, one recent board election, where well over 12% of the voting unit was subject to challenge. And I know anecdotally from that election, some employees never voted. But even if this process goes exceptionally well, explaining to voters that the challenge ballot process goes like this, this, and this, you have people waiting this long line. This takes time. If it's up to 20%, it will take a lot of time, and they may not ever vote. I submit to you this will decrease voter turnout, and it's repugnant to our whole voting process in this country. If you do continue to use the challenge ballot procedure as a linchpin for this rule, I would submit to you that challenges ought to be resolved prior, not in the front of a voter. That voter ought not be subject to this type of potential abuse. There ought to be a cap on the number of challenges that could be presented. And frankly, the challenge ballot procedure should have a number on the ballot, not the employee's name. There are a number of things. I could go into this much greater detail. I've given a lot of thought to this. I just submit to the board that using the challenge ballot procedure to remedy post-election issues is not good for anyone, particularly the employee. Thank you.
I have a question for you. I read your comments about the challenge ballots, and I basically had this question about it. I mean, the board has always had the challenge ballot, I don't know, forever and ever, but for decades had a challenge ballot procedure, right?
Yes.
And would it, do you think, be useful in connection with the proposed rules if the notice of election actually set forth who would be eligible, who may be unresolved and challenged, and sort of what the challenge ballot process is, so that people would know when they went in that this was part of the voting process and that this is the way it works?
I think, Member Schiffler, I think that would be helpful. I would go further if we go down this route, that only the board agent could be the challenging party, if you will. I would not permit the employer or the union to challenge based on some anecdotal evidence that I have experienced. What I didn't mention, sometimes a challenge voter will go back to his or her department or unit and say they're challenging people in there, you don't want to go in, and you chill the environment that way. So there could be reforms. I mean, I agree. But the data from the board from 2011, 2012, and 2013 shows a very infrequent use of the challenge ballot procedure. And expanding it to 20%, I think, is just flat wrong.
The data you're relying on, these are determinative challenges?
They are challenges, Member Schiffler, that were made. I don't know if they were determinative or not. The average number of challenge ballots was only 4.5 per election, and most of them were 5 or fewer employees. But I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I wondered about that too when I read that as well.
Go ahead, Harry.
Oh, sure. You're talking about pages 10 and 11 of your 2014 comments, right?
Yes, Member Johnson.
Okay. I didn't quite catch, because I know you were trying to get through a lot of material there in the comments. What really is going to be the incremental delay that you predict if suddenly we have a much higher frequency of challenge ballots beyond an average of 4.5 an election, or whatever your statistics say?
The points we were making at pages 10, 11, and 12 did not speak to the so-called delay issue. They spoke to the chilling of participation and the potential lowering of voter turnout and the concerns associated therewith. There may very well be increased litigation as a result of the voter challenge process. That has been spoken to by a number of my colleagues. But it was more a procedural concern about how, Member Johnson, this process works and how it's detrimental to employee free choice.
Okay. You just mentioned longer post-election proceedings, and I was trying to figure out what you meant.
Well, my point on there, and I know where you are in the paper, my point is there that there may very well be increased litigation on the issue of who was challenged, who was not, and you've heard this before, if the number of challenge ballots are not, as you know, dispositive, determinative of the outcome of the election, and the union is successful, the status of the individual's challenge will not be resolved by the board in the first instance, and you will have to resolve that issue either at the collective bargaining table or through a unit clarification proceeding. And that's what we meant by incremental litigation.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to the main topic, and specifically the closing statements and post-hearing briefs. And I understand that there are very significant policy considerations that we'll have to grapple with to figure out what's going to produce the best decision-making process. But as a matter of law, if it's the regional director that makes all these determinations, is there any legal problem with the proposed changes concerning closing statements and post-hearing briefs?
Member Hirazawa, I think there is to this extent. If the hearing officer has made recommendations / determinations, that is an issue, whether it's addressed in briefing or not. But the issue ultimately on briefing, is it helpful or not, I think that's a policy decision. I would concur with you. Ultimately, I think the board, the parties are well advanced in their decision-making to have the benefit of that briefing. I read board cases almost daily. I think I stay on top of the law, but for me, at the end of a representation proceeding, to be able to articulate in a closing argument all the relevant cases, particularly now in the community, in the overwhelming community of interest test, that's a challenge, I think, for any practitioner. So I do think briefing has a legitimate place. The final answer to your question, there's been some discussion here today about the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. I know you practiced for many years in the courts, in your private practice experience. I think you would have to concede that their briefing is permitted. And I think we can draw some valuable experience from the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure here.
Thank you.
Thank you all.